Welcome to Transform Now, a podcast focused on intelligent automation and brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. On this program, we talk about how organizations globally are rethinking the way they operate, utilizing process orchestration and AI-enabled digital workers to free up humans to do the work that matters most. We also share insights and tips on how you can embrace this new way of working and unleash your full potential. Let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Our guest on this episode is Juliette Powell, author of The AI Dilemma: 7 Principles for Responsible Technology. She's also a television creator with 9,000 live shows under her belt, an international speaker, and an AI expert. We're going to dive into how this all fits together, by the way. Juliette's extensive experience has given her a unique perspective on how organizations and the people who power them will be impacted by the massive changes in AI and intelligent automation. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Juliette.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to it as well. Thank you so much for having me.
So you have a very unique background, and I'm sure I didn't cover the half of it. Can you give us like the speed version of how you got from where you started to this whole AI thing? Because I think it's a really strange, kind of interesting loop. So I'd like to hear from you.
Sure, I'll give you a quick tour of the loop. I was born in New York City. I grew up in Montreal, Canada. And because Canada was 80% broadband, I had access to the internet very early on, became a coder. But one day I saw somebody doing something on TV. It was an interview and it was done so badly that it actually made me believe that I could do something better. And I followed up by literally stalking the television network and getting a shot to do an interview. And I worked in television as an on-air person doing a whole lot of entertainment. I eventually also merged my studies where I was studying at McGill University, International Business and Finance, and wrote a TV show that I gave to my bosses. And they liked it so much that they brought me to the larger network in Toronto, where I had a chance to really work on both. So doing live TV, yes, doing all the interviews and presenting them on the air, but at the same time, looking at the data on the back end and figuring out how to please the audiences, but also how to please advertisers. And how do you balance all of those things simultaneously? In the process, yes, ended up doing about 9,000 live shows, which means that I was in charge of 4 different shows. Most of them are entertainment, and then also took on some financial news shows as well as some hard news shows. And I literally spent most of my early adult life on television. I would eat it, sleep, breathe it, but at the same time, really taking into account all of the data, how we influence people using that data, and how it was also used to create value and a whole lot of monetization. And as a result, when I came back to the US, I was just fascinated to see what was actually happening on the ground with social media, how your I guess your social graph really influences the individual, and then how your data is used to influence you on one end, both for consumer purposes, also for political purposes, but also in terms of your general outlook about who you are and what your place is in the world and what you can potentially achieve. In 2012, I was asked by Intel Labs to help them map the personal data ecosystem from a global perspective, trying to understand who controls our data and what they're doing with it and how we can create a more equitable world using it. And through that process, was lucky enough to go back to school. My dissertation was on the limits and possibilities of artificial intelligence and self-regulation. I came to the conclusion that self-regulation wasn't really possible if we really want to create the best outcomes with the technologies that we have for the majority of people on the planet. And by the time I had finished my dissertation, they were already talking about the Artificial Intelligence Act coming out of the EU. And I was lucky enough to be working with Art Kleiner, who was at Strategy and Business, PwC. And I sent him my dissertation. He said, "Oh my gosh, you've written a book." So transformed that very academic work into something hopefully more palatable for the everyday person. And today I'm lucky enough to travel the world, yes, keynoting on AI, but also consulting, doing our AI advisory, and especially helping organizations, big and small, understand the risks and the benefits as they develop and deploy AI throughout all processes, both internal as well as external. So it's been a fabulous life so far. I'm a lifetime learner, obviously, and I also consider myself to be the chief experimentalist of my own life. And I think companies need to start approaching AI as small experiments as opposed to just scaling everything and then realizing, hold on a second, we hadn't taken all of these negative unintended consequences into account so that we can use the technology, leverage it to the best that we possibly can. Yes, for monetization purposes, but also for human benefit. I think those two things can work hand in hand.
Yeah, I can imagine. Mentioned a couple of different things that all of a sudden sparks whole bunch of off-script questions that I have to ask because
But probably more interesting.
so you mentioned you work with Intel, learning about who manages and controls and how our data is used. Did that terrify you
Why would it?
in terms of the fact that our data is lost in an abyss with infinite lifespan?
No, that doesn't terrify me at all. I think it's a fact, something that we should all know about and that we should all understand much, much better as we navigate our online personas. Yes, but also the way that we use things, simple as a text message or the kind of communication that we do using a Zoom, for example. All of that data is collected by companies. All of that data is repurposed by third party vendors who then resell our data to be packaged. That to me is not a scary thing. It's a reality. And it's up to all of us to decide what we want to do with that knowledge.
So I guess the way I'm coming at it is the fact that your experience and your research have shown what you understand right now. I suspect that if I went out and polled 80% of the people out there would say, I have no idea how my data is being used or what data they collect.
Right.
And they would probably be shocked about the data that is out there on them and how it's being used and repackaged. So maybe for you, it isn't terrifying because you understand the approach that these organizations are using and how this data may or may not be used. And you can adjust the way you approach your online persona to be
Mhm.
able to protect yourself from potential misuse of your data. Whereas I'm guessing majority of the folks out there probably don't think that way.
Probably not. I am a little bit of an anomaly. It's not just because of my background, but definitely because of the way that I think.
I can imagine. Well, you might also mention something about you're your chief experimentist or whatever on your career and your pathway in your life. I suspect that's something that a lot of people would probably do well to adopt on their own. How did you come into that kind of viewpoint?
I think that as I was growing up, I did not fulfill the expectations that others had of me, is the truth. I was 6 foot tall by the time I was 12. And so everybody thought that I would become this incredible basketball player. I have no hand eye coordination whatsoever. I'm really bad at sports. I was really into math, I was into physics and languages. And nobody could really understand what my path would be because they had such set expectations based on the way that I look. And as a result, I think I got very lucky because I didn't depend on what the school advisors were telling me I should do in the future. I relied on my mom, who was my best friend, and her biggest wish for me was that I become the best at what I do, no matter what I choose to do. So if I decided to be a street sweeper, that I'd be the best street sweeper in the world. And I think that kind of unconditional love and confidence in your child makes all the difference in terms of the way that I viewed my possibility. In terms of the chief experimentalist of my life, I think as we went over some of the turning points in my career, you pointed out that it's quite unique and diverse. And so every project, every new skill that I've taken on has prepared me for this moment. And we're just at the beginning of many things that we take for granted, like the internet. We're just at the beginning of AI. And I'm so incredibly lucky to feel like I was born at the right time in history, at the right place to be able to shape the future. Because as systems learn to not only take on more and more responsibilities, but also replicate themselves, a lot of these negative biases that including the expectations of people that might just be judging you for one part of your data or another part of your data, including the way that you come across, is being embedded into our system. So we need to be aware of how the systems are working and also what the implications are. I think that we're aware that our systems are the ones that guide us from most of our shopping habits when we're online to our dating profiles, to which apartments we rent, what schools we go to, what jobs. But I speak to organizations like HR conferences that are trying to figure out how to use AI to remove negative biases. And at the same time, because they're deploying at scale, are in fact embedding these negative biases in the systems that they're using and using historical data on who the best people are within the organization to lead it. But they're not necessarily pulling any kind of data that will allow them to understand what the leader of the future needs to be like. And
Right.
that's a really important key.
Well, I appreciate that perspective, and this kind of leads into back to your book because quite honestly, your book, while it deals with technology, it deals a lot more with the humanity or the human side of technology. And as you just talked about there, there's a fine line with ethics and innovation, and I want you to explore that because I think it's really important to see your perspective on this.
Sure. First off, I don't talk about ethics because when anybody raises the issue of ethics, I think ethics for whom, right? It's never going to be for everyone on the planet. It's always going to be for a specific subset. And so I'm not necessarily an ethicist, and certainly not by training. I do believe, however, in responsible technology, that we take responsibilities for the technologies that we develop and that we deploy and the way in which they behave. And that it's on us as humans to keep a check on those systems, just as we create our systems to keep a check on us humans in our own failings, right? So I think it's a two-sided street. When I think about artificial intelligence in any of its forms, I think of a socio-technical system where, yes, we're creating these systems, but they're shaping our behavior. And in turn, we are shaping them. So it's a two-way street. And that might be the first time in history that we as humans have really encountered that type of technology. And I don't think that most of us really understand to what extent they do shape us.
So, getting back to this concept of I have to say ethics because I'm not really the responsible use of technology
Mhm.
and the ownership of data. We have the idea that I'm not sure, I'm just taking me as being an average person. I'm not sure where my data is being used or how it's being used, but I'm sure they're
You know
using it
what your
somehow.
So let me ask you a quick question. Do you know what your credit score is?
Yes,
Do you know how it's calculated?
not a clue.
None of us do. And state by state, it's going to be very different. That's a really great example of what happens with our data. It gets collected and it gets distributed to places like Equifax, who then use a number of different weights that are invisible to us to determine what our credit worthiness is, which impacts what we're able to do, whether we're able to get a mortgage, what rate that mortgage might be at, whether we can drive a car, whether we can do so many different things that we don't even think about on a daily basis because it's an of course. So the more that we're aware of our personal data and where it lands, the more likely we are to see that even if we find out where it lands, we still don't know what's behind the closed box. So the
Right.
algorithms that essentially influence all of us. And I think that's just for that reason I think we need to ask better questions of our data, better questions of our algorithms, and better questions of the companies that are deploying these technologies.
So credit scores are one thing where our habits determine some of those things. One of the ones that have come up recently was this concept that Scarlett Johansson and OpenAI and the use of a voice that sounds very much like her, even though it may not have necessarily been her, it has sounded very much like her, was being used to be the persona for the OpenAI voice interface,
One of
or at
them,
least one of
yes.
them. Yeah. So we look at that and the concept or the idea that the data that can be collected from us, perhaps some people who are more vocal in on social media or on TV or movies or whatnot, where their likeness and their persona can be captured in ways that perhaps an average person couldn't. We have
Oh,
yes.
wait a minute. Let me stop you right there. Actually, all I need is 3 seconds of your voice to be able to capture it and create a system that will say anything that I choose to make you say.
Yes.
And we're seeing also things like what happened in New Jersey, where students got a hold of some Gen AI and decided to make some deep fakes of their fellow students.
Mhm.
It does not take much. Everyone now has access to that technology. Everyone. And whether you're paying for it or not, there's a lot of open source Gen AI right now that's even less safe.
So, given that the discussion based on the responsible use and the access to data, which now is unfettered through social media interactions, or even spam phone calls where you say, "Is this so and so?" You say yes. All of a sudden, now you've got some additional data points that perhaps you didn't intend to provide. Where does that responsibility and how does an average person protect themselves from irresponsible actors?
That's a great question and something that we're all trying to navigate, especially because the technology itself is accelerating far quicker than we as humans can begin to wrap our heads around it, let alone deal with it. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing some legislation in the United States that counters deepfakes for well known personalities, including, yes, celebrities, but also politicians. We know that the elections are coming up in
Hmm.
November, but there are also about 60 free elections happening around the world this year. And so that potential for disinformation through deep fake is a global one. This is like the year where we find out what we as humans are really made of. And if we let our technologies really influence who's going to win our various elections, that will change the world if we do, and potentially tip us into non democracy as an overall leitmotif for the world. It's terrifying stuff. I don't know that we've even begun rather to grapple with any of this stuff on a societal level. I know that there are many activists that are trying to push politicians to do something, but ultimately, I don't know to what extent that's going to happen quickly enough, to tell you the truth, at least in terms of the elections.
Yeah. So, getting back to an average person,
Yeah.
when they understand the little amount of data that it would take to them to be deep faked or to be put in
Persuaded. Think
position,
of Cambridge Analytica, right?
right, to be put in position to be motivated to do something perhaps they didn't expect to do, or their persona and then took on the ability to do those things. Whereas, from a humanity standpoint, where do we hold the responsibility for our own safety and data? How can we protect that within our own interactions? Because in fact, we are going to continue to be more on social media. It's not stopping. We're still going to share pictures of our children and our dogs
Are
and
you?
our what we had for lunch. And what do you mean?
This is the question. Ultimately, I think it depends how nervous you are. I know a bunch of people that don't share children on social media
Hmm.
anymore,
Hmm.
that they just refuse to because they don't want to put that,
How?
I
But
guess,
why
that
do they? Why
pressure
is
on their,
that? But
because
why
they
is
don't
that?
want to put that kind of pressure on their child. They don't, like some people actually start a social media account for their child when they just find out that they're pregnant. And as a result, this child has this digital profile, whether they choose to or not. There are other parents that are doing the opposite. They're saying, you know what, when my child is old enough, we can have that conversation. But in the interim, no, I'm not posting and I'm not sharing. I will do
What's
with
the
my
difference
family.
between those two parents then?
I think that some are potentially more digitally aware of the negative potential consequences of doing so. And so one is trying to avoid risk, and the other one is just saying, hey, everybody's doing it and we'll figure it out. Right.
I
One
think
has more trust than the other, perhaps, in our ability to deal with these things.
this goes back to one of my earlier questions, which was you have seen over your lifetime this transition and you understand its potential implications. I would suspect that most don't. Even with
I would agree with you.
education campaigns, I would think most don't. So where does that come in play then from an organization who is either adopting or leveraging some of this data for their own use?
So first off, my perspective is very much shaped from my childhood, where again I grew up on television, which was like a fishbowl. So whether we're talking about social media or not, I was always deeply aware of people taking pictures of me, video, what could be done with any of that information. Again, I grew up as a coder as well, so that might have something to do with it. But for the average person who isn't necessarily thinking about all of those things, I do feel that in the larger scope, it's up to the powers that be, governments and regulators, to really tweak the mechanics of the regulatory machine to make sure that we're all protected. One way that we could do this on a global level is personal data ownership. So if I own my data, you owned your data, the everyday person on the planet owned their own data, they could control it. They could say, yes, Google, you can use my data to do X, Y, and Z, but you can't use it for these other things. Or, yes, I want to donate some of my medical data, for example, in terms of doing cancer research or anything else, climate change. There's so many vectors that we could solve using our global personal data as well as AI together. At the same time, there are many reasons why it would be very difficult to pass that kind of legislature. First of all, as most politicians are being lobbied by big organizations, and big organizations pay a lot of money to be able to monetize our own personal data. So, how do I keep my data safe in a world in which it's being leveraged left, right, and center? I think, firstly, to be aware that it's being leveraged by anything and anyone. And as a result, to become much more conservative about how you share your personal information. My co author, for example, still shares his phone number in every single email that he sends. Do you realize that the phone number that you have, your mobile number, is likely the number that you've kept the longest? In other words, some people use landlines, some people don't. When you're at a job, you've got one number, you change jobs, you've got another number. But now that mobile numbers have been something that you can navigate from one carrier to the other, a lot of people have kept their phone numbers for 20 or some odd years, which means that every single time you entered your phone number online, for anything, and a lot of times they ask you a phone number when you're entering a credit card information, then it gets tracked. And all of that information ends up on the dark web, and they collect profiles on people so that we're seeing more and more people as identity get hacked. And that's what happens, is that every single time there's a breach with Equifax, every time there's a breach with Facebook, every time there's a breach with many of the tools that we use on a daily basis, that information on each one of us gets collected and it gets sold. And in some cases, it's very nefarious. There are other things that we're still trying to figure out, right? I don't know if you heard about this, but I think it's something that everybody should keep in mind. Yes, it was in Hong Kong back in January. There was a heist, a $25 million heist, but the first of its kind. So there was a banking person that was invited to enter a Zoom call with three of his colleagues that are all senior people in the bank. And the person was instructed via Zoom to do $5 million transfers. It turns out that he was the only real person, physical flesh person on that call. Those three other high-ranking members of the bank were in fact AI that were generated in real time, so that all the passwords, all of the expressions, everything that might have identified these people to this real person were there and
Hmm.
generated in real time. So yeah, the man made the 5 transfers, $25 million heist. If that can happen at this point, anything can, because banking is one of the most highly regulated industries in the world.
So,
Think about
so you're again going back to the data ownership and the way that it's used or misused. I know whenever we use any website or anything, if we're using it for free, it's very likely that some part of that licensing agreement is the fact that they can and will capture everything about us during whatever transactions we choose to have with them. And that's part of the deal. So when you look at organizations who are building this type of technology in for better customer service or profiling their customers based on transactions and whatnot. How can an organization be responsible or fair in a way that will allow their customers, us, to feel comfortable about the way we interact with them?
I think first and foremost, it's really important for any company that is either developing or deploying both to really do a serious calculus of intentional risk. In other words, to not just weigh the risk and benefits of the bottom line. How much am I going to be able to monetize this opportunity and cut costs? It's much bigger than that. It's a risk benefit analysis that also takes into account if you get fined, for example, by the European Union and their Artificial Intelligence Act that comes into effect in 2025. So that's next year. If you're deploying a chatbot, is the chatbot making people think that it's human, for example? If it is, then you're de facto in a high risk category if in the European Union, if any of your training data, and if you're not the one who's actually training your AI system, you probably won't know this until you get caught. But ultimately, many of the systems that are out there that people are using, that organizations are white labeling or tweaking and implementing new products and services with, are being trained with data that does include citizens from the European Union. And as a result, you can get fined up to 7% of your global revenue, not your profit, your revenue, plus any, if you get sued and you lose and people actually got hurt, that means any damages as well. So that's hundreds of millions of dollars that I think the average company, especially not in the United States, has not even begun to think about. Most big tech companies in the US are still trying to work their way around GDPR. So this new legislation that's happening, I think for any organization that is either creating and or deploying artificial intelligence in any of its forms needs to be aware of how to build towards this regulation so that they're not slapped with a fine every month. A. B, it's really important for organizations to come up with some form of AI governance, which means understanding, yes, what you're doing with the technology, but also what are you not willing to do to make a buck? And it's not just about the C-suite coming up with these things. This is really an organizational learning opportunity where everyone in the organization should be able to weigh in. Also, within organizations, some people, and it really doesn't matter what their job function is. Some people are using the technology on their own. Some people aren't. Some people are using it in their jobs. Some people aren't. It'd be really important for organizations to get a better handle on these complexities and maybe leverage the people that are using these tools effectively and seeing what they're doing and learning from that. So it's a wonderful opportunity for organizations to really maximize the bottom up potential of AI governance, AI usage, AI deployment, creating safety groups, creating accountability within the organization, meaning not just some nebulous group that are going to make decisions that are completely unenforceable. There have to be not only rules, but also how are you going to enforce those rules and what are the fines? What are the pain points that will really shape the behavior around these technologies? And then once you've made some of these decisions, these are not fixed decisions, it's an ongoing evaluation. Never deploy at scale without doing a whole lot of experimentation. And when you are developing, it's really important to include the communities that the technology is intended for so that they can start thinking with you what the potential negative outcomes could be, not just the beneficial ones, but the negative ones, so that again, you can design for that. Really important to do before you start building, while you're building, and after you're building, and including that feedback on an ongoing basis within the technology itself, but also in the way that the organization and the teams are thinking about the technologies themselves. Does that make sense?
It does. The question I have is sort of around that culture piece, baking that culture in when in fact, perhaps maybe currently it doesn't exist. How would you expect that to manifest itself in an organization who I mean, they may be thinking about the fines, but they may not understand how to build a culture to responsibly use AI. How would that look?
I think that just about any organization right now has been trying to figure out how to retain employees. We've seen quiet quitting, we've seen massive quitting, we've seen massive layoffs. It's really been a roller coaster ride in the last 2 years. And I think that when organizations are hiring, it's incredibly important, yes, that the person fit well with the prevailing culture, but also that they be really technically able. And when I say technically able, I mean digitally literate. It's one of the requirements that we're seeing in more and more universities, like Columbia University, my alma mater. You can't even apply to the business school without at least knowing how to code in Python, without having a sense of how to use R. So students that are coming out of these systems are very savvy, very digitally savvy, also very business savvy. And the missing piece there is the responsibility. So in many cases, it's actually up to the organizations to bring in people, both on a consultancy basis, but also to hire people, where it's not just a chief artificial intelligence officer, it's also a chief responsibility officer who indeed has to train the AI people and everybody else within the organization on how to do things responsibly. And there are many ways to do that, which we don't have time for now, but I do think that piece should not be expected when you're hiring people that are focused on AI, because that, depending on where they went to school, is not necessarily part of the curriculum. And certainly for people that are self-learned, which by the way, in many cases far surpass those that went to university to learn anything AI related, are not learning either. So that's a really fundamental question that you're asking there. And it's a question that organizations themselves have to start to ask if they want to be responsible. And it's difficult because they're getting a lot of pressure from their boards that are reading all of this stuff about AI and, oh my goodness, we should be making more money than we are. And why aren't we leveraging this? Sadly, the ROI isn't necessarily there, especially if they're not thinking both in the short, medium, and the long term around these things.
So I know you also teach classes at a university in New York. You likely will bring these types of things into bear. When you see the state of broadly the state of education and the way that universities are presenting this material, I imagine
Yeah.
you see organizations or these universities that are doing it in a good way and those that aren't doing it maybe less. Where do you see our educational system moving towards, or do you see a change that's going to happen at the college level, at the middle school level? Where do you see this happening to be able to allow people to be more digitally literate as they're getting the, say, functional educations related to business?
I feel like you've asked me a bunch of different questions in one there.
I try to load it up as much as I can.
So I was lucky enough to start coding because my mom was taking night classes. She was going to work full time and would go to university at night. And because she didn't have any money, she would bring me with her instead of paying for a babysitter. And so I got to sit through all of these amazing university classes and I learned how to code at the kitchen table with my mom. We would do our homework together. And I feel like there's so many opportunities for parents to sit down with their children at every level. In some cases, if they're younger children, then you're guiding your child, but they're also guiding you. If you're middle aged and your parents are much older, they want to use these technologies too. And so there's the bi-directional learning. They're going to know things and you're going to know things. Perhaps with their wisdom, they can teach you a few things like don't leave your data everywhere. In other cases, you get to teach them how to do it responsibly and not be taken in by theft, identity theft, and fraud. But I think that organizations need to take the same approach. I love the idea of geeks and geezers working together. One has more of affinity for technology, and the other has a lot of life wisdom that should be applied to these technologies. And so I see teams working together, different kinds of teams. So older people and younger people, not just functional teams, as in marketing and sales working together. Yes, that's important, but also I think that geek and geezer mentality is incredibly important. So I think that I asked the question myself at NYU. We ended up doing scenarios for the future with the team at NYU that is tasked with envisioning what the university will be like in the next 5 years. And because they chose to only do the exercise with full-time faculty, as opposed to with the actual stakeholders, the students, I was taken aback. And so I decided to do the same thing with the students and then share what they came up with the full-time faculty. And it was shocking how much of a bifurcation there was in terms of expectations of what a single university should be in the next 5 years. The students wanted to see more technology and lower tuition because technology enables a university, for example, to do far more with a MOOC, for example, than what a physical campus can do. And in the case of the faculty and the people that are actually in charge, for them, they felt that tuition probably wouldn't go down, that likely it would go up because they wanted to better educate students with more professors and less technology. And I thought that was particularly interesting that they weren't interested in what students had to say. In fact, it was quite shocking. And then I was even more fascinated that many of my students for thesis, so this is the final course before they get their master's degree as creative technologists, many of them started startups when ChatGPT came out, leveraging the technology to create more tailored education. And many of them, that was their final project. Clearly, there's a disconnect between what universities are seeing and what students are seeing. There's also a disconnect in what older people are envisioning with AI technology and tailoring education and what younger people are seeing. What the younger people were telling me is that they actually trust that we will be able to tweak our technology well enough so that it provides more education, better education, more tailored education for more people. And that's really important when we think of the entire world and not G8 countries. Professors in the institutions, on the other hand, felt because Gen AI hallucinates, that there's no way for these students to be able to develop the critical thinking needed to be able to navigate a digital and AI enabled world. And I think that both of those perspectives are probably true and need to be integrated more.
It makes sense. Making the assumption that AI will improve, that we are not at the pinnacle of all AI ever, what excites you about the prospects of where this technology may go in the future?
I'm very excited about where it is now, which bodes well for the future. So, for example, I'm seeing again more and more students that are leveraging these technologies to start their own companies. That is incredibly exciting to me. Seeing entrepreneurship go up, especially when it comes to AI, means that there are more people and more diversity of people that will be shaping the future of the technology and therefore the future of the human race. And that to me is amazing to see. And I love being a part of that. I'm very excited for all of us because of that. I'm also incredibly excited about what we can potentially do with AI. And I mentioned earlier, pick a vector, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about targeted medicine, whether we're talking about finding better housing solutions for the everyday person and also for the unhoused, whether we're finding more targeted medicines and medical devices. As we've seen, I think there have been about 123 new medical devices that were discovered in 2022 thanks to AI. So that bodes also for us as humans living much healthier and longer lives. Also, we've got so many problems that I really do think that if we work together with our technologies as opposed to just following it blindly, we will get a lot further and for do better for a lot more people. So I'm incredibly excited about all of that. And with this idea of responsible AI, that also means that more people get to be involved in the decision-making process of where we wanna go. I think ultimately, the fact that we can still figure out at this point in time whether we wanna use AI for the technology race, for the arms race, or for the human race is amazing because next generations might not.
Interesting. And why would you say that?
So you might have seen or heard about a declaration that was signed in England in November of 2023, and we saw 20 nations sign on, including the United States and China, saying that we would not use AI to supervise nuclear weapons. And the reason why that became so important is because if even one nation decides to do that, then we've essentially lost control of this idea of keeping humans in the loop. If a system sees something that it thinks is an attack, as we saw, for example, and this is a little bit of it's an example that I use in the book. This is not AI related, but I think it gives a sense of the urgency of what happens when the people in charge think that weapons are coming towards their country. So back in 1983, there was a gentleman that was sitting at the controls in the USSR. His name was Stanislav, and it was up to him to decide whether he was going to retaliate when the systems told him that American missiles were coming in. And he, because of his training, because of his intuition, did not listen to all the people in the room screaming at him to push the button. He decided to ignore all of the sirens and alarms that were going off, and in a split second decided that it was a system malfunction. Had he decided to retaliate, he would have essentially started World War III. And this is a story that not enough people know about, and that is not something that's going to go away. Our systems fail us. But if we don't have humans in the loop to actually make those kinds of decisions that affect all of us in the world, then we're in much deeper trouble than we realize.
Gotcha. Juliette, I really appreciate all of your perspectives. Your unique background, I think, has given you insights that most of us probably wouldn't have been able to make. So I really appreciate the way you have shared those insights in your book, but also here with us today. So thank you again for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. I hope this was good for your audience. Anybody, reach out to me if you're curious. I'm on LinkedIn. And I hope we get a chance to talk again, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C Blue Prism. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of intelligent automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.